Okay, everybody, for our grand finale today, it's my pleasure to introduce this panel on a subject which not only do the panelists have lots of thoughts, I think this audience will have many diverse perspectives, and this is a long-standing question, particularly interesting in macro, and perhaps there's maybe a bit more hope in the air on this than there has been for a while, because artificial intelligence might be an incipient general purpose technology, but of course hard to know, and so I expect that we'll have some interesting perspectives that are looking backwards and some interesting conversations about what might be coming up next. And so I think we're going to have about a 10-minute presentation from each of the panelists, and then it'll give us time for kind of broad Q&A, and I think we'll have some pretty good dialogue, I hope. Okay, so we're going to go with kind of an alphabetical order, which I think also works substantively. So John is going to go first, and I think I can't see Bob on the screen right now.
Bob's in the corner.
I'm looking the wrong way. So Bob, you're going to go second, if that's okay.
Yep.
Great. And then Pete will go third, and then Huiyu. Okay? All right, John, take it away.
All right, thanks very much. It is a great honor to be here, of course, at this conference in honor of Zvi. As we heard from Kevin earlier today, there are two requirements for presenters. The first is we have to say something about Zvi, and second, we have to try to do it in the style of Philippe. So I can at least say that I will try to say something about Zvi. Well, that's maybe the feeling of being a Philippe talk. It is also a bit of the feeling of where are we now in terms of kind of the roller coaster of productivity growth, and we think of the future. But I did have the honor of knowing Zvi. I was a Harvard student in the late 80s and early 90s, so Li was there as well. Adam, of course, was there at a rather more esteemed level than I was. And I was working on productivity issues. But I did not, in fact, work with Zvi on productivity issues. So I had that misfortune of not having him as an advisor. I came from the macro side. I'd been working with kind of Barrow and Summers. Summers went off to Washington, and then I was working with Greg Mankiw. And then I started looking at productivity issues and started working with Dale because he had data. So I came really more from the Dale side. And it was more in the 90s that I saw much more of Zvi kind of at NBER meetings, at least kind of in a professional setting, and certainly learned a lot from him, as we all have. And in fact, as we all continue to come to appreciate his work more and more. Now, what I want to do in kind of my time is basically talk about this figure, ruminate a little bit on it, which is U.S. productivity growth, output per hour, for selected time periods going back to the 1940s. So you have the high growth decades right after World War II. You have the first productivity slowdown in the 1970s. You see the decade of fast growth in the 90s and early 2000s, and the past 20 years of slow growth. Now, if we want to explain this, a natural thing that certainly as a macroeconomist, you start thinking of Solow. Now, Jim mentioned many of the predecessors to Solow's work, including Tinbergen. Solow does not cite Tinbergen. He does cite Abramovitz, Fabrikant, and others. But more relevantly, famously, of course, Solow has found that in trying to explain this, 87.5% of it was technology. Inputs explain very, very little of that. Now, for our purposes, more relevant is actually Jorgensen and Griliches, 1967, and their R.E. Stud paper, which is the way growth accounting gets done to this day. It's kind of still the frontier, it's still the benchmark of how we do growth accounting. And what was the kind of the big innovation there was just thinking, Solow had kind of crude measures of output, some crude measures of input, and Jorgensen and Griliches really pushed, we need to measure things right. We need the right measures of output, and which means you need the right deflators. You need kind of thinking, maybe building on some of the T.W. Schultz things, who Solow does cite, kind of thinking about different types of labor and how you take account of that heterogeneity. How do you take account of different ways, types of capital, and of course, and even getting capital deflators right, something that Bob, of course, contributed enormously to later on, but all of the hedonics and the things that Zvi did went in. Now, they had this hypothesis that they wanted to test, that if you did measure everything properly, then growth in total factor productivity should be negligible. Now, there's some debate, some back and forth with what they found. Here's what the current vintage of data show. So blue is TFP. It explains roughly 2/3 of labor productivity in a very proximate sense, right? This is output, capital per, quality adjusted labor. Composition of labor matters. Capital deepen, capital per quality adjusted worker matters, but it's really, you got TFP. So far that does not look good. Well, then we get to the 70s, the 73 to 95 period, and now the good news, Jorgensen and Griliches were right. TFP growth almost disappears. It's negligible. Now, the bad news is, bad news is growth almost, slowed down, or out productivity growth. We didn't have growth to explain, but also we don't agree on why. So even Zvi actually wrote his, trying to see, can we explain it from reduced innovation, from maybe R&D? He called that a non-explanation for the productivity slowdown. Now, Bob Gordon, in various pieces, of course, Bob has talked about how it was the end of the great, we had all these great 19th century innovations that were perfected over the next, 3/4 of a century to a century, and you can only kind of do some of those things once, and things became more incremental as we find at that point. Now, my PhD thesis was when I was looking at productivity. I didn't know the GPT literature at the time, but I was thinking about the interstate highway system and found that it really boosted private sector productivity when it was first built. But you build it once, building a second interstate highway system wasn't going to have the same kind of networking benefits. But I think that kind of falls as one example of the sorts of things that Bob has talked about. Now, Solow, of course, came back in 1987 with a quote we all know, we see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. Well, one answer to that was Greenwood and Yorokoglu's a paper that they wrote in 1996 called 1974. Now, what happened in 1974? Well, the PC was invented. Now, their story was kind of looking at all the GPT literature, general purpose technology literature, was people started diverting resources from current production towards investing in learning, and in ways that were not necessarily going to show up in the R&D statistics, so much broader measure of investments in innovation. So now we think of this kind of in terms of just broader measures of intangibles that weren't in the output data, that aren't in the input data. So roughly, we have this New Yorker cartoon gets it. We have lots of information technology. We just don't have any information. So you have to take kind of the time to, the effort to get the information to figure out how to reorganize things. Now, Sam Kortum commented on Greenwood and Yorokoglu's paper, and sort of towards the end, it was basically his critique of it is, well, according to the model and their calibration, productivity growth should return to its pre-1974 rate, well, about 20 to 25 years after the slowdown, sometime in the next year or two. Productivity growth should rebound to the 3% range. And he said, there's no sign of this yet. Now, he was doing this in 1996. Here's what the data now look like. Greenwood, Yorokoglu got it right. They got, it's like you got next year, they were just at the first year of this new pickup. So that looks like really good for their story and the intangible, the general purpose technology story. Now, I wrote something that kind of supported the GPT story. We were inspired by Greenwood, Yorokoglu, by Eric Brynjolfsson's things, and kind of a story of, and you find kind of like some timing, like industries that invested a lot in previous decades got a bigger benefit with a big long lag in a way that was associated with these unmeasured investments in innovation in intangible organizational capital. Now, Bob, of course, was writing at the time about, well, does this, that this innovation falls short? Well, one way of thinking about that is the Greenwood-Yorokoglu model. Something Sam pointed out was, well, according to this, you should get once you finally get the returns, you actually shouldn't just get 3%. You should get 2 decades averaging 5% productivity growth. Well, we didn't get it. So, Bob, you were right. In fact, and then the growth rate disappeared. My own take on this was, I wrote a paper, in the macro annual paper, TFP growth slowed before the Great Recession, and it looked like it was the unwinding of the exceptional ICT wave, right, in terms of which industries were benefited and then disappeared. Bob was actually in the audience at the time, and I had not been thinking of Bob when I wrote this paper. I think I did have a citation. I checked that to you. But in the presentation, after the presentation, Bob stood up and said, "It took you 14 years to finally agree with me." I remember standing up there and having this sinking feeling of realizing Bob was right. I had not thought of him, and he was right. Now, in the pandemic, we had headlines like, "The pandemic blows up old business habits, opening a new path to a boom." Or are we in the cusp of a new roaring 20s? Or in 2024, the New York Times, a couple of months ago, asked, are we in a new productivity boom? Right? We've got the dawn of new technologies like artificial intelligence and hybrid work schemes. Maybe these gains will turn into a lasting boom. Well, here's the data for the period since the end of 2019. There's nothing there. Oops. And so, in fact, Huiyu and I wrote a couple of things on this, concluding we're on the underlying trend. You look at this, maybe our conclusion, Huiyu, is not very surprising. Now, as I wrap up and think about the future, my few final comments, is I see, is information technology different from previous ones? Well, we've seen, along with IT, this big rise in the importance of intangibles. And much of that is because ICT really often, much of it is intangible, and it facilitates into other forms of intangibles, economies of scope and management, output that's digital. And we now have multiple papers by my panelists, by Nico and his co-authors, by Martin, talking about how it may actually sow the seeds of its own demise. And we saw Nico's paper on that yesterday. Now, when we think about AI, well, it might boost the production function, right? Well, Kareem yesterday talked about how we've seen it starting to fuse into use of, into research, and so maybe we'll get a large payoff, or maybe it's part of the ongoing kind of innovation process consistent with what we've got, we've been seeing, and it might kind of like a little like the IT revolution, make us more productive at creating barriers to entries, right? So keeping competitors out could also be a new engine for distraction. For example, we all now know that ChatGPT will talk to you using Scarlett Johansson's voice from Her. And so that's been in the press the past couple of days, that raises its issues. And when we're all kind of living in the metaverse and on our way to living in the matrix, that's going to raise a lot of challenges for measurement and for national accountants, as well as for those who want to be doing kind of looking at productivity statistics using firm data. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. So Bob, you're going to go next.
Okay, you should be able to share, Bob.
Yeah, no, I'm looking for a share screen. There we go. Okay, so nice to be here from a hospital room in an international conference. Glad that this worked out, at least so far. You can hear me? Okay, John did a great job of looking at the past post-war era and putting in some really interesting layers of comments. I'm going to look at the future from the perspective of the past. And now the question is, how do I get the slide to go down? Oh, good. Okay. Will productivity growth over the next 2 decades be 1%, 2%, 3%? The CBO's most recent forecast is 1.4% for the next decade. And this, of course, is for the total economy. Important to note that when I show you numbers, it's for the total economy. John's numbers were for the private economy, and his, of course, were higher for well-known reasons. I'm going to review the history for the U.S. much more rapidly than he did for the U.S. and two other entities, the E17, which is all 17 nations of Western Europe that were not in the communist bloc before 1990, and what I call developed East Asia, also since 1950. And what is there in recent history that we inherit in looking forward to the past, that we're our sort of takeoff point? So here is a chart very much like John's, except horizontal instead of vertical, shows the same thing, the two slowdowns. The numbers are all smaller because it's the total economy. Shows the same conclusion, that we had a big slowdown after 1972 of about 1.5%, another big slowdown after 2005, about 1.4%, and no speed up at all since 2019. Now, here's Western Europe, the 17 nations weighted by GDP. And here you get an inexorable, steady slowdown from the Les Trente Glorieuses, the great productivity miracle of the post-war years, which we'll talk more about in my keynote speech tomorrow. We'll talk a lot more about it. And we've got a steady slowdown since the early post-war years. Up until 1995, Europe grew faster than the U.S. After 1995, Europe's labor productivity has been substantially slower, and you can see that it's slowed down since 2019 at the bottom. Here's developed East Asia. This is Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Singapore. And here you see also a steady slowdown, but all the numbers are higher than they are for Europe. So we confront this history. For the United States, in the 50 years since 1972, we've had 40 years of total economy 1.3, 1.2% productivity growth, and only 10 years of this 2.6, double the productivity growth we got from what is universally, I think, considered to be the IT revolution, the third industrial revolution. Why have we had this set of slowdowns up until now? You know what I'll say, that innovation is becoming less potent, that we used up some of the benefits of earlier inventions. Pete Klenow will tell you that ideas are getting harder to find. We have an educational attainment plateau I'll talk about for a minute. And we have corporate profits, instead of being used for fruitful technology producing innovation and productivity producing innovation, we've got corporate profits being used for dividends and share buybacks. And I wanted here to endorse John's recent paper on shocks versus trends in productivity growth. He has a concept of capital deepening, which essentially allows feedback from TFP. If you get low TFP, it feeds back to the profitability of investment, and it means you get low investment. I call this the feedback effect, and it's very much built into his recent work. And I've long believed that one reason we've had a slowdown in investment is because of this feedback from lower TFP growth. What about the educational plateau? From 1900 to 1970, the high school graduation rate went from 10% to 80%. There was a gradual increase in college completion. And for the whole 20th century, Golden and Katz, in their landmark 2008 book, added 0.4% to labor productivity growth for this educational attainment bonus to productivity, the rise in human capital. But we're done with the high school completion achievement. We can't achieve that more than once. I might add as a side effect, I don't have this on a remark on this slide, we also had a one-time bonus for the near elimination of gender discrimination and the at least partial elimination of race discrimination. So these are all, again, these one-time things that we can only have once. Now, what about the completion rate for four-year BA and higher, master's and PhD degrees? Amazingly, the completion rate is exactly the same, 39%, for those born in 1968 and those born in 1997. 30 years with no increase in completion. This is 5-year intervals going back to the pre-47 generation. And you see for the last 6 5-year cohorts, we've had no improvement at all. A little bit of an upsurge from 39 to 42%, but then back down to 39% in the last interval. So we've got the end of education's contribution to productivity growth. And worse than that, we've got a decreasing demand for college education because of rising tuition, soaring college debt. 50% of BAs cannot find a job that requires a college degree. We have the low U.S. standing on international PISA tests in math and reading and science. And we have a lack of a German-style systematic apprenticeship system. We also have social issues that are inhibiting social mobility and education mobility. Among the age 25 to 54 prime age group, the share of people who are married is down from 67 to 53%. The unpartnered that aren't even cohabiting are now up to 38%. And so we have all these children of single parent families, and we know that they enter life with great handicaps. Let's not forget the fiscal debt and the fiscal crowding out that, again, is going to push against our ability to innovate with large R&D expenditures. We have an aging population that implies a growing dependency ratio. Sustained consumption is going to be combined with a labor shortage. The old people will consume out of their pensions, but they won't be working. So we're going to have a labor shortage. And we're going to have, as we already know, a depletion of the Medicare and Social Security trust funds, the need for higher taxes or lower benefits, an increase in the share of debt service in GDP. Those are the numbers from the CBO most recently, but we may have higher interest rates to go with it that would make this an understatement. And all of this stuff is going to crowd out private investment, government R&D, and infrastructure spending. And let's not forget about the green technology transition. Green transition implies crowding out. If we discard fossil fuel heating and industrial equipment to be replaced by electric equipment, that's going to require investment that we would not have to do otherwise. We're going to have to replace the entire diesel truck fleet. We're going to have a multifold increase in the electric grid for electric vehicles. And we're going to have, because of all this crowding out, less R&D and productivity-enhancing technology. There is a partial offset. We know that the green transition will involve at least 2 forms of productivity improvement. The auto industry will be improving productivity, particularly when we include all the supplier industries, because you need fewer parts to make an electric vehicle. And of course, solar and wind generation does not require any employees at all once it's installed. Well, what about the AI revolution? First of all, it's not new. Eric Brynjolfsson was talking about the 4th Industrial Revolution 11 years ago, at least. And we've already had a large entry of AI into customer service, phone responses, voice recognition, language translation, legal searches, radiology, diagnosis. And we now have the LLMs, the large language models, creating written text memos, sales pitches, moving and still images, and of course, making it much easier to code software. How many jobs will vanish? I find it very useful, and I'm going to come back to this tomorrow, to divide up the economy into 3 types of industries. The first type of industries are producing goods. They're manufacturing, mining, construction, and utilities. They make up 20% of employment. The next group makes contact services. That's where people are actually physically touching or in contact with the box of goods in the case of retail and wholesale, or the service itself in the case of transportation, recreation, food, education, and health. And the remaining, so 53% are in contact services, 53% of employment. So that leaves a lot, but only 27%, not 100%, are sitting at their computers creating computer content that is in principle replaceable by LLMs. And those are the industries that contribute the 27% of employment. And of course, you know that not all of them are going to be replaced by ChatGPT. So how many jobs will be lost in the creative services? Substantial job loss, I think, primarily starting with software coding and image creation, marketing documents, and TV scripts. But each call to an LLM requires a person to feed prompts and review results for errors and hallucinations and check copyright violations. We haven't even got to the settlement of the New York Times copyright case. LLMs are trained by scraping the web. They know the past, but they don't know the future. I've got a good friend who's a top-level management consultant, and he says that you are not going to get LLMs to come into a company and figure out what's wrong with that company in the context of the experience of the management consultant and plot a path for the future. So, conclusion, pros and cons for faster growth. We've had a 1.2% starting place since 2005 for the total economy, a little bit slower than the CBO's current forecast. We've got an educational attainment plateau, fiscal crowding out, student debt, government debt, the green transition. A fourth industrial revolution, I think, in terms of how much of the economy are actually affected in terms of what people do in their daily lives by LLMs, compared to the enormous effect of the third industrial revolution, the transition from typewriters and file cabinets and paper to everything digital. So our main source of optimism is AI. It will impact at least 25% of the workers, have little impact on the other 75% of the workers. And who knows what Zvi would say if he were here today trying to ponder all of these conflicting directions. Thank you.
So I'm heavily influenced by the Bloom et al. Paper. So TFP growth, if you think about the research component, there's also human capital and things like allocative efficiency. But if you think about the research component, you can break that into research efficiency and research effort. This is using non-rivalry of ideas. The scale of research effort matters. And the good news is that research effort's been growing secularly. And the bad news is that since growth has been constant or falling, that must mean that research efficiency is falling. And that's the Bloom et al. Paper. The ideas are getting harder to find. And related to that, going forward, population growth is falling. So not only do we have falling research efficiency, but the research effort might not be growing as fast going forward. Uh-oh, I can't advance. There we go. These are pictures from Chad. There's TFP growth being stable or declining, and then the effective research effort growing by a factor of 20. So that means research efficiency must have fallen by a factor of 20. As an aside, you might say, is this true in things like computers? Well, everybody knows Moore's law. I'm actually the Gordon Moore professor at Stanford, so it's near and dear to my heart. So it looks like constant doubling every couple of years, which is 35% annual growth. But the effort that goes into each generation of processor has grown by a factor of almost 20. So research efficiency in the semiconductor industry has fallen dramatically as well. Okay, and then here's the population growth. This is from a paper by Peters and Walsh that's emphasizing that if you have the semi-endogenous growth view of the world, this Romer/Jones view of the world, that the declining population growth in the US and other R&D doers in the world is pessimistic about future growth. So that's even more pessimistic than Bob that's saying, we might, or John that's saying we might be down to this 1.2, 1.4. This is saying we're going even lower because we're not going to have the same growth in the supply of talent to produce research that we had in the past. Okay, now what about the creative destruction perspective? It's not necessarily separable. It might be similar, but that's Haltwanger, Jarman, Miranda, for example. Many papers emphasizing young firms have more growth potential. Akcigit and Kerr having stuff about them having more creative patents that are cited more. AAA BK, as I call it, have a model where you start out young, it's very innovative, and then as you age, you inexorably decline. Very depressing, but Huey and I have a paper where we estimated a lot of contribution from new firms and generating genuinely new varieties. And then the recent paper that you saw Timo present that gave a bigger role to smaller, younger firms. So the additional bad news from the Schumpeterian perspective is that entry rates down. You know, it's declining dynamism as this declining rate of turnover of firms. Entries down, exits down, rising concentration as a byproduct of that. So again, all kind of very depressing. Okay, so now I'm going to say something positive. I want to be the Sam Cordum role of things are about to turn around, and I said, oh, it looks bad. So there's a lot of room for more talent, taking greater advantage of the talent we have. Mercedes was just talking about the fraction of patenters being only about 14%. If that should be 15%, 50% based on talent, that's a lot of room for better allocation of talent among research. And then the world over, think about all the, there's a great study that came out in AER Insights, a paper I handled, where the Math Olympiad, if you're a top scorer in the Math Olympiad and you're from a developed country, very high probability of becoming a researcher and patenter. If you're from an emerging market, very low probability. So that says there's all this talent in the world that's not being able to become researchers. Now, Carnegie Mellon and MIT are developing a scholarship program for that, to bring them into PhD programs or even undergrad to start that process. So arguably there's plenty of room, plenty of runway for taking more advantage, even in a limited population growth world, of the talent that's out there. And a related thing is that there's been a startup boom in the United States. This is just saying we get China doing a lot more research. So not just places that aren't doing that much research now, or parts of the population that aren't, but China emerging as a major research power, presumably India increasingly so as well. So there's lots of room for more talent to come online, so to speak, to do research and innovate for us. Innovate for us the world over. On the startups, this is kind of remarkable. Many of you have probably seen this. This is the flow of new startups, and it's almost doubled in the pandemic. And I thought, okay, this is a fluke. People can't work for their normal jobs because the whole sectors are shutting down, so they're just starting up some boutique business. But it's associated with a lot of jobs. And even before the pandemic, you see the vast majority of job growth was coming from these new startups. So it's not trivial in the net employment growth sense. So that's giving me some optimism that something real and positive might be happening there. We'll see whether it continues or not. And then, of course, there's AI. And so we have dueling papers by Daron that say, maybe 7 basis points a year, which isn't trivial. It's 7 percentage points after a year. So I'm not going to turn that one down. 7 basis points a year, so 0.7% after, sorry. And then we've got Aghion and Bunel saying more like 0.7%. That's what's going to accumulate to 7% after 10 years. And that's AI in production. You have this beautiful paper by Aghion, Jones and Jones. It's tough to keep up with the Joneses in the growth literature. You got Ben Jones and Chad Jones. When they combine, it's even more powerful. So they have this beautiful paper saying, if we're running out of talent, or population growth to do research, maybe the AI can do research for us, or at least be a complement to if we think about how much computers have helped us as researchers, maybe AI will figure out a way to do that as well. So all the trends, I think, are generally negative, except for some of these in the last few years, and then maybe we've got this talent to take better advantage of. So I'm cautiously optimistic, conditionally optimistic. How's that? Thanks.
Okay.
All right. First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to participate in this conference. I learned a lot from listening to everyone, especially on the history of economic thought in my literature. So it's been very enlightening. It's really nice to see where all the big ideas came from. All right. So since I have 2 of my co-authors on the panel, I was able to coordinate with them. So I want to talk about a couple of points that... Sorry. Yeah. So, I want to talk about a couple of points that complements the things that they mentioned already. So first, I was glad that Bob mentioned aging. I think aging is an important topic for discussion as well, so I'll talk about that. And then now I know there's a lot of discussion about AI, but I think work from home is also transforming the way we work, how production is done, so I would like to discuss a little bit about that. And finally, I would like to talk a little bit about the framework for thinking about the slowdown in productivity growth and for AI going forward. So Bob mentioned the dependency ratio in his talk. So this is a graph that illustrates that. So this is the number of people aged 65 plus per 100 people aged 15 to 64. It's usually called the dependency ratio. So Japan is in the worst case. That's the first line at the top. So by, say, 2100, for every 100 people that are in working age, you expect to have, it's projected that Japan will have 70 people that are over 65. And then the other lines are US, Western Europe, and also developed economy. So there is very fast aging in these economies. And if we focus in Japan, Japan is pretty dramatic. So this is from my paper. So this is comparing 2018 actual population age distribution against the red line, which is the 2055 projection by the Japanese government. So you have you have the first baby boom, and then the boomers' kids, which is the second baby boom. And then the red line shows by 2055, the largest group in the population will actually be people like around 80 years old. So Japan is definitely facing aging. So aging has, I think, received a lot of attention about how it may affect output per worker, so idea of labor productivity. I think there are papers that are thinking about the investment savings channel, the labor supply, labor quality channel. But I think there might be something interesting going on with the productivity channel. Productivity is in TFP channel as well. So this is some work I've started with people in Japan, looking at labor productivity and also sales of firms and how that relates to the age of the entrepreneur. So the left-hand side graph is sales of the firm, and we see this inverted relationship with age. It peaks at 40 years old for the entrepreneur, and this is relative to people who are 30 years old. So people who are 40 years old have 20% higher sales than people who are 30 years old. And then this size declines with age. The right-hand side is sales per worker. It's revenue productivity. You can interpret as productivity, but mostly there's a lot of wedges in there. But we also see this inverted relationship. Things tend to peak around middle ages. So this is for Japan. For US, I think there's similar evidence by Pierre and also Ben that it's usually the middle ages that seems to be doing pretty well in terms of as entrepreneurs. And so, of course, this is not causal, saying that these folks are less productive, because there's some selection going on in Japan. Like people age 60 is actually the largest group in terms of entrepreneurs, even though they have lower sales and lower labor productivity. But overall, I think there's some interesting channels that could be happening here, relating aging with productivity, directly affecting TFP. Okay. So on work from home, I think there's a question about how work from home will interact with productivity going forward. I think I don't see any consensus in the literature right now. So there's mixed macro and macroish evidence. Bob have worked on that. John and I, we looked at that. John and I, we didn't find any systematic relationship between teleworkability of an industry with productivity growth changes since the pandemic. So we didn't find any relationship there. And then on the micro evidence, there are a lot of people doing really good work there, but I think the evidence is kind of mixed, which might be expected because there could be multiple channels for work from home to affect productivity. So I started some work with Julien Sauvegnat and Tom Schmitz, looking at the French data as well. We linked the French labor force survey with the worker survey. And what we found was that the propensity to work from home differs quite a bit across firms. So firms that are younger and larger and with higher revenue productivity tend to have more likely to have workers that are working some days at home. And these are not actually explained by demographics of workers. So this table is a regression of propensity for workers to work from home on the firm age and size employment of the firm. And we find that younger firms tend to have more workers who tend to work from home, and larger firms tend to have more workers working from home. At first, we thought some of this might be related to just demographics of workers related with firm characteristics, but we try to control for employee age, gender, education, like whether they have children or not, and we still find this relationship. So we think that maybe work from home adoption is different across firms. And to the extent we think that this changes the way firm produces, maybe there could be some productivity effects as well. And then finally, on how to think about the slowdown, I think this might be relevant for thinking about how AI may affect productivity going forward. So there is a large literature on the slowdown of US productivity growth. I think my reading of literature is that there are many mechanisms that are talking about steady state growth slowdown, and then there are also many mechanisms for transition to a lower level of productivity. And I think when I think about effects of AI, learning from my work with Philippe and Pete and Timo and Antonin, that maybe it's useful to think about the transition as well as the steady state together. So this graph is productivity growth by the same subperiods that John showed. The difference in the label is that John thinks time is continuous, which is true. But so he labels his things as like 1949 to 1973, and 1973, 1995. For some reason, the growth literature, usually we cut it, even though time is continuous. But this graph looks very similar to John's graph, even though this is all total TFP growth. I think my takeaway is that the TFP growth actually explains the part that we don't really understand. The residual explains a lot of the ups and downs of growth rate in the US. And so this is statistical models would say that, as John was saying, that US productivity growth goes through this low and fast growth regimes. And for the switch from the 1995 period to the high growth period since 1996 to then the slowdown in 2006, so my work with Pete, Philippe, Timo, and Antonin, as well as Martin's work, and then we also saw Nicola's work. In our research, the exogenous force is ICT revolution. So ICT revolution in some way reduced the cost of either the marginal cost or the overhead cost. And that generates a burst of productivity growth as the economy transitions to a new steady state. What I want to emphasize is that even though we have, which arguably to the firm might be an exogenous shock coming from technology, what happens in the economy is endogenous, because growth during the transition as well as the new steady state really depends on market incentives and how firms react to this. So this is from my work with my co-authors, and what we find is that once the shock hits the economy, depending on how the firms compete and how firms adapt, how long is the transition, how fast the growth, how big is the growth burst, and where we settle down in the BGP all depends on market incentives, depends on policy. So I think this type of framework for thinking about the transition and the steady state together is potentially helpful. In our paper, for example, because of this transition that's going through the firm size distribution, the transition can actually be pretty slow. And as a result, the welfare effect is ambiguous. Like the ICT shock, even though it reduces costs, it could actually be bad for welfare if there's enough disincentive for innovation. So I would like to leave it at that. But I think for thinking about the effects of AI going forward, maybe this type of framework, thinking about the transition and steady state together, will be useful.
Okay, thank you, Huiyu. So, and well timed. So maybe I'll just make one comment before we go to the audience, where I know there will be many comments, and I'll just say something about AI in this context. I think it really comes down to whether we think it's a very general purpose technology, how general. And ICT seems to have that delayed boom, and is it sort of like at that level? Is it less than that level? Is it beyond that level? And I think one way to think about it is that the production economy is a series of tasks, and what share of those tasks can an AI do? And if that share is large, there's a basic back of the envelope logic that if you sort of replace 10% of the tasks with a machine, then all the labor you replace eventually reallocates to the other tasks and produces 10% more of those, and then capital does the other, so you sort of get like an elasticity of one. So you can get big or small increases in GDP per capita based on the percentage of tasks you think AI could actually, that's the general part. But I would also say that it's more interesting than that, right? Because it's the question in the knowledge production function where I think we know a lot less, especially about capital inputs. Like, we always think about people as the constraint in creativity. I certainly do that, and I'm guilty of that. But thinking about what about machines? And Ina yesterday was having a paper that's starting to get at sort of helium and other kind of capital inputs. And what's interesting about AI is it's not the laser matters a lot. A lot of things matter a lot. Centrifuges, telescopes, but those aren't general purpose. They're very field purpose. But AI is cognitive tasks, and like, what do we do? And what are the hard parts? They're cognitive tasks. And so when you go to the Silicon Valley side of this debate, these people who think that AGI, artificial general intelligence, is around the corner, they're thinking that you completely relieve the problem that is in Chad's work, which is that we ultimately are constrained by the number of minds. It's something that Pete was emphasizing. If we really can scale minds because we have AGI, then it's a very different world. That would be like the super optimistic end of things, which I think we probably are very skeptical of. But that's not the view among the technologists. They're actually much more optimistic about that, whether they're right or not. I don't know. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say. Because I think there's a huge upside potential, but it requires certain beliefs about the breadth of AI and how it can affect the knowledge production function in particular. Okay, Philippe.